All right. We should get started. Good morning. Okay, so we have a huge amount of ground to cover. So let's see if we can cover it. Where's the starting point? I know where the ending point is. Yes, we started with the Big Bang. And then the second axial age. Okay. So so let's briefly bring us back up to date to where we ended. And that is again beginning with the reality and the challenge of the Baha'i faith that we're here to transform the world and to bring humankind, or at least be the leaven that leavens the lump, be the catalysts to assist in what we admit is the inevitable process of the emerging maturation of the human race. We look back into the mists of time and can maybe dimly make out the dawning infancy of the human race, our first awareness of a moral dimension to existence, perhaps in the story of Adam and Eve. We can look at another, let's say, turning point or a great transition in human civilization when we look back at what has been called by some scholars the first axial age, during which almost magically similar transformations in perception were taking place from the Far East in Taoism and Confucianism, in Buddhism, in India, in Zoroastrianism, in Persia, and some of the Old Testament prophets. I'm moving from east to west, and then on the western edge, the emergence of ancient Greek philosophy. Now, there are obvious differences between all of these. It wasn't, the emergence of the same philosophy or the same doctrine, but there were certain elements that they all had in common, which is fascinating to look at. Elements that might be gathered together in the idea that there's an axis, to life, a vertical axis, by which we can ascend. And out of this emerges the idea that we're on a journey, humanity, from the physical plane to the spiritual plane. But this idea of there being an axis and there being two stories to the building came under siege over the last few centuries, as humanity passes into what we might call the second axial age, what we might also call our passage from childhood into adolescence, and we hope onwards to maturity. And one of the features of that second axial age, as with individual human beings in their adolescence, is a rejection of everything that came before, rejection of all forms of received knowledge, of authorities of all kinds were tossed out the window, to be brought back in our maturity in a transformed form, no longer absolute, but seen in all of their intrinsic relative nature, and that was one of the points I think we started talking about. That and one of the great insights of the scientific revolution, and that which followed, the scientific revolution being, we might say, the first great fruit of the second axial age, a realization that we do not have absolute knowledge. All of our knowledge is relative. That the project of science is a project of building better models, And as good as our models are, even if the models are exactly correct, as far as our observational precision permits, even in such a case, as scientists, we can never make the claim that this is the final theory, that this is it. Because it may always be the case, and the story has been repeated time after time, that when we think we have it, we think we have that final equation. At some point, a little tiny deviation from the expectation enters in. Is it first ignored, explained away through other devices, but then ultimately becomes the wedge which opens up a chasm in that way of thinking and forces us into a different way of thinking. And so we understand then that the scientific project is a relative project, and that our approach to truth is fundamentally relative. But by saying it's relative is not saying that anything goes. By saying scientific truth is relative is not saying that anyone's impression or anyone's equation is equally good as anyone else's equation. That's not what relativity means. Relativity means that there may be different perspectives which may be approximately true within their own domains, but that the ultimate truth of things is unattainable. And this ends up being one of the great, I think, insights of the Baha'i faith, and one of the great teachings without which we can never really unite humanity. Because we either unite humanity by somehow bringing everyone around to believing exactly the same thing, or we admit that humanity by its nature is diverse, not just in color, not just in culture, and food and dress and language and so forth, but fundamentally diverse in the way we think about the universe. There are ways of looking at the universe which sees things more in black and white, and there are ways of looking at the universe which sees things more in shades of gray. These are let's say, attributes of human souls that are not going to go away. Even in whatever ideal utopian world we can imagine, the golden age, it's not that everyone is going to believe the same thing. There's still going to be people on different kinds of spiritual paths with different kinds of ways of approaching the divine. So this is one way in which there's a principle in the realm of science, this idea of relativity of truth, this idea of model making and our approximate approach to things, which has a parallel in the spiritual world. There are other, I think, fascinating parallels between some of the great and deep principles that have been discovered by modern science and spiritual ideas. Another one of these is implicit in, so the one I was just talking about, this relativity of religious truth, was the point of Unit 2. If you recall, there were several examples given where Baha'u'llah was asked questions that seemed to press a point, that seemed to invite Baha'u'llah to discriminate between two camps and say this one is right and that one is wrong. And time again, he refused to draw that bright line and divide things into a black and white kind of true-false dichotomy. And time again, he would say both are right and true in their own perspective. This is one of the, I think, really deeper truths of Baha'u'llah's mystical works that divide the spiritual path into different valleys. The 7 valleys, the 4 valleys, gems of divine mysteries, as well as several other mystical tablets of Baha'u'llah that talk about spiritual stages that have not yet been published, but I can say they've been translated and will be forthcoming soon. And in one of these tablets, Baha'u'llah talks about the mystical journey, and he says at one stage in the mystical path, the whole concept of stages gets tossed out the window. And so even the idea of stages itself is a relative, is part of the relativity of the spiritual path. So another let's say potentially deeper truth that's implicit in the Baha'i writings was brought out in Unit 3 and that contained a number of different quotations that seemed to collectively cast doubt on our certainties about God, God's existence, God's attributes. It's common for us as Baha'is in trying to boil down what the Baha'i teachings are, to say fundamental Baha'i teachings are the three onennesses, the oneness of God, and the oneness of mankind, and the oneness of religion. And if there's anything that's sort of more, that nothing could be more certain, we might think, than God is one. Okay, that's our foundation. It's sort of everything's built on this fundamental idea that God is one. But some of the quotations we were seeing suggest that even that idea is a relative truth. We saw Abdu'l-Baha in some answer questions saying that God is sanctified beyond singleness, then how much more beyond plurality? So the very concept of oneness and plurality is a feature of this material world. It's not a feature of the world beyond. The very idea, as we saw in Unit 4, I think, where this very challenging quotation by the Bab about prayer, where he says if the worshiper worships God as the object of his worship, then he's never worshipped God and is joined partners with God. That's one of the most challenging things I've personally ever seen in the Baha'i writings, because it turns upside down the entire way I thought about prayer. Growing up as a Baha'i, it seems to turn upside down the whole thrust of the obligatory prayers that we see every day, and every other prayer in the prayer book. You're addressing God clearly as the object of your prayer. There's a relationship with that being to whom you're addressing. There are things you're asking of God. There are, praises you are praising of that being. All of this is in the mode of you're the subject and you're praying to God as an object. But then you come across this passage by the Bab, which says this is a form of idolatry. So what's going on here? Is God an object or isn't God an object? Is there a way of thinking about the divine which transcends the distinction between subject and object, just as there is a way of thinking about the divine which transcends the limits of oneness and plurality, just as there are ways of thinking about the divine that transcend the limits of existence and non-existence? One of the core Baha'i ideas about God is that God is unknowable, that there are no attributes that reach to that reality. All the attributes of God are in fact attributes in the world, and they pertain to the manifestations of God, not to the essence of God. God's essence is beyond all attributes. So God's essence is beyond even existence and non-existence. We can't say anything. The moment we open our mouths, we are already deviating from that ultimate reality which is beyond being spoken of. And in that sense, Eastern religious traditions kind of on the right track, in not talking about God as in the very concretized way that they are in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. But there's the story from Buddhism of the man who shot by the arrow, and it's a poisonous arrow, and he's dying, and they want, and they come up to him to help him to take the arrow out, and the man says, wait, before you take the arrow out, I want to know, who shot this arrow? Who was the fletcher who fletched the arrow? What was the tree from which the arrow was taken? And the answer is, you don't need to know any of this stuff. We just need to take the arrow out. And our desire to sort of get at, what is the reality of God? What are the to sort of to confine it within some sort of theology is like that person who was shot by the arrow. And what really is needed is our action in the world that will be the remedy to heal us from the poison of that arrow. That's the thing we have to worry about, not where the arrow came from and what tree it was cut from and so forth. So in saying this, and this is, I think, touching upon one of the more challenging principles that's found in the Baha'i writings. And this is exactly one of those ideas where Shoghi Effendi says the teachings are like a sphere and there are points on opposite poles. So that quotation by the Bab is like a point on an opposite pole. This point about God being beyond subject and object. That's like the opposite pole. We're used to seeing one hemisphere of this three-dimensional thing in the Baha'i writings. It's like the dark side of the moon. We've only ever seen, one face of the moon. The other face of the moon we had never seen in all of human history until we'd sent, a spaceship around to photograph that dark side of the moon. We knew it was there. We just didn't know it was on the dark side of it. In a similar sort of a way, most of the Baha'i writings are in the language of God as object of worship, as creator, as having a personal relationship with us. But the other side of that sphere, which on the face of it seems like a contradiction, but in reality is not, because both are relative perspectives. That other side of the sphere you have to dig a little bit harder for. You have to search a little bit more to find that complementary idea. This idea of complementarity is what I want to really leave you with on this topic. That there are, in some of the, and I think it was, who was it who said this? It was Niels Bohr, one of the architects of quantum mechanics, who said that the deepest propositions in nature are those whose opposites are also true. The deepest proposition in nature are those whose opposites are equally true, are also true.
True as an opposite or just true?
Equally true, And I think he was probably thinking about the quantum properties of light and fundamental particles. Light was for a long time thought of as a wave. It had wave-like behavior. You could, shine light through a prism and it would break out into different wavelengths. All of the behavior that people, could attribute to light, all the tests that they could make of light confirm this idea that light is some sort of a wave phenomenon. And so there's a whole theory that, well, what's it waving through? It's through some sort of ether, and there's a whole theory of the ether that provided the substrate through which light could do its waving. But somewhat more recently, a different set of experiments on light were made using very sensitive photographic plates and turning the intensity of the light down so far that what was striking the photographic plates was not some wave-like behavior. It wasn't waves of light, but it was individual particles of light. And there's a contradiction here, because something can't be a wave and a particle at the same time. Waves and particles are two different ways of describing matter, and it's either one or the other. And this is one of the most mind-bending results of quantum mechanics, that matter and light at the most fundamental level has both particle and wave-like properties, but never simultaneously. Whether it shows up as a particle or a wave is a function of how you set up the experiment. It's a function of your perspective, in other words. And how, quite literally, the lens that you cast it through will determine whether you observe it as a particle or as a wave. And this is another deep principle of the physical world that the scientific revolution has brought to us, and that is that some of the deepest truths of the physical world are complementary. Complementarity is baked into the laws of physics. And by complementary, I mean certain properties you have to choose. Certain properties of matter become visible only depending on how you choose to observe them. And you have to pick one or the other perspective. You can't have both perspectives at the same time. And this principle of complementarity in modern physics, I suggest or propose is there in the realm of religion as well. That there's a principle of complementarity at work in the Baha'i writings. For example, in this idea of God being in most of our prayers very clearly an object of worship, but in other writings, such as that quotation by the Bab, being something other than that, as being either beyond the subject-object distinction, or in the hidden words, turn thy sight unto thyself, that thou mayest find me standing within thee. There's a trace also of that, that's not God as object, that's God as subject. In the last of the valleys, in the seventh valley, Baha'u'llah says, and this was in one of the quotations, I think, that the seeker in this valley, that all he hath from heart to skin will be set aflame, so that nothing remains but the friend. So the self, the veils of the self, which on an everyday basis we take to define our beings, our personalities, who we are. At some stage in the spiritual journey, that self is burned away, and nothing is left but the friend. Us, what we think of as us, is now gone, and what's left is something. It's divine, but it's not our personalities that remain. And this was another one of these challenging quotations from the Bab in Unit 4, which is quoted in Nader Saidi's Gate of the Heart, in which the Bab identifies the soul. Also, maybe the second most challenging, or equally challenging, from that other quotation by the Bab, in which he says that God desires to describe himself to himself, and this divine self-description, he said, some have called the soul. So, he says God desires to describe himself to himself. Another way of saying this is Abdul Baha in Paris talks about there being four kinds of love. There's the movement of love from the creator to the creation, to the creatures. The movement of love from the creatures to the creator. The movement of love from the creatures to the creatures. And then that fourth, very strange, mystical love, from the true one to the true one. And Abdul Baha, in Some Answered Questions, doesn't say much about it, but he gives us one little hint. He says, through a ray of this love, all the other love comes into being. So that primordial love of God for his own essence, which is referenced also in the Hidden Words, is in some way the origin point of all of creation. And this love of God for his own essence, you can imagine, is a circle. But it's a circle because it has to emanate from God in order to return to God. It's the circle of consciousness that we, I think, started talking about a couple of days ago. And that circle is comprised, as Abdul Baha says, of arcs of descent, and an arc of descent, and an arc of ascent. And we put ourselves in a very special place because we always like to, think of ourselves as the center of creation. So we put ourselves along this arc of descent and ascent at the very bottom of the circle. So we're still special, because we're at the bottom of the circle. So we represent the inflection point of the end of materiality and the beginning of spirituality. But the thing is, that dividing point between material and spiritual moves along with the evolution of things. And so, if we were other than human beings, we would still put ourselves at the center of that arc of descent. Because from where we stand ontologically, there's always a behind and an in front. There's something behind us and there's something in front of us, as if you're going around a circle. There's only two directions. If your universe is traversing this circle of descent and ascent, there are still two very well-defined directions. There's what's in front of you, and there's what's behind you. What's in front of you is what we call spirit, and what's behind us is what we call matter. But since we're moving along that circle, we're traversing that circle, what we call spirit and matter is a function of where we are in the circle. Right? Spirit and matter are not these eternally unchangeable, Cartesian, separable things like Descartes thought, where you've got material things and spiritual things, two-story building sort of a thing. It's constantly in motion. And what we call spirit is simply what's in front of us along the arc of ascent. And as humanity evolves, we have enough cultural memory to be able to go back in time and to imagine a time when things like lightning and earthquakes and the tides and storms were purely spiritual phenomena. These are the actions of the gods. This is Zeus throwing his thunderbolt. This is, and so forth. When the animals, the motion of animals were spirits. Animals, the whole world was infused by spirit to pre-modern man. And that's an example of how what was spiritual, as our understanding of the universe increases and expands, what used to be spiritual, since we've gone along the arc of descent, and now that's behind us now. That's now been subsumed within our understanding of the physical world. And now we call it physical. It used to be spiritual, but now we call it physical. And just one more thing, and then I'll take a question. But there's a tablet by Abdu'l-Baha. I hope it was in one of the units. I'm pretty sure it was. I think it was in unit 6, where Abdu'l-Baha says that people think the world is divided into spirit and matter, but really it's all one thing. And he says, furthermore, he says, to the vegetable, the animal is the spirit. That's a mind-blowing thing right there. That's a one-sentence kind of mind-blower, because it takes the concept of matter and spirit and it relativizes it to within the context of the arc of descent. So it says that, okay, you're at the vegetable level, all right. Spirit to you is whatever's in front of you, i.e. the animal, the human, and everything beyond that. You might have a dim perception of the animal realm because you're being eaten by it if you're vegetable, right? But you really have no idea about the human world and its, the mental world of the human. As humans, we might have some idea of of a spiritual world, but only the faintest of ideas, only in flashes, and no ideas about what's beyond. Although Baha'u'llah tells us it's all the worlds of God that we traverse. It's not just this world and the next world, but it's all the worlds of God. Sheila, did you have a comment?
I have a question about the circle.
Yeah.
You say that we are on a circle of ascent, but as far as our soul is concerned, our spirit, when we align our will with the will of manifestation of God all the way up, we are not coming back again. Right? So where is the circle?
Right. So Abdu'l-Baha says that the point on as the point traverses the circle, he said it makes no retrograde motion. That was one of the quotations, I think, in Unit 7, which doesn't mean that we can't revert. I don't think he's saying that there's no going backwards spiritually. It's more of a very cosmic statement of the flow of things. That things are flowing from God, or to use the correct technical term, things are emanating from God, because an emanation is different from a flow, because an emanation does not partake of the substance of the thing that's doing the emanating. The universe does not partake of the substance. I'm already using the word substance in relation to God, so this is already, an approximate realm we're talking about. But the idea of emanation is that the rays of the sun don't contain the substance of the sun itself. It's separate from, and that's a way of separating the concept of God from the concept of creation, sort of maintaining the idea of God in its own realm. Of course, in saying this, I'm putting God up as a subject, or as an object of thought. So this is all in the realm of diffuse, fuzzy thinking, where we're using words. We've got our sticky notes, and we're putting sticky notes on these concepts. But where is language getting us? in the end, this whole set of concepts is only worthwhile if it has cash value in the world. Yeah. This whole set of concepts is only useful to us if it solves a problem. And at the end, I want to ask, what problem could this be solving? It's not solving a problem. This is just useless speculation and theologizing. I do think it solves the problem, though. But there was another question, though.
Yeah, I was just thinking of that movie where the Coke bottle falls out of the sky and
the gods must be crazy.
Yeah, and they worship it because they don't know what it is. So it's kind of like that for us too. As long as we don't know what it is, then it's spiritual.
Then it's spiritual. Great example.
Technology and science comes up with the answer for it, then it becomes matter, right?
Yeah, that's a perfect example. Yeah, the Coke bottle falling from the sky. It gets interpreted as a spiritual event.
A question on that.
Yeah.
If we are moving from things we used to think were spiritual and we consider them more material now, the implication is we never move from that bottom spot. We just keep putting more things behind us.
Right. Are we moving around the circle, or is the circle moving underneath us? Yeah. It all depends on your perspective. You could look at it either way. Either way might be equally useful. And in the end, the question is this useful? The question isn't, is this ultimately true? Because we don't know. We have no access to ultimate reality. We have no way of measuring our theories against reality, because there's no yardstick that sort of reaches to reality that we can measure these theories against. All we can do is ask, does this theory help? In the terms that Baha'u'llah makes in the Tablet Manashi Sahib, he calls himself the divine physician, whose job is to diagnose the ailments of the human race and prescribe the remedy. And that's what religion is. It's a remedy for the ailment of the age. The ailment of today is disunity. Is this way of looking at the world a way of solving disunity? Embracing the idea of relativity of religious truth, is that going to help solve disunity? And this embrace of the idea of relativity of religious truth, it's both spatial and temporal. By that I mean it's true in time. We're already familiar with this progressive revelation from one age to the next, from one prophet to the next. This religious truth evolves and changes with the capacity of humanity to understand it. Of course, there is an unchanging thing. Baha'u'llah, we talked about a couple of days ago, Baha'u'llah tells us what the unchanging thing is. It's this law of love, which is always flowing. And that law of love is equal to, is the same thing as the circle of consciousness. But so relative religious truth is true in a temporal sense, sort of along the time axis. It's also true in a spatial sense, and that's what I was talking about with the 7 valleys and the 4 valleys, where in any given moment, there are different spiritual paths. The 4 valleys is more explicit about this even than the 7 valleys, because you can read the 7 valleys as a single seeker goes through these 7 valleys. But in the 4 valleys, it's not a progression. Baha'u'llah says at the beginning of the 4 valleys, there are 4 different kinds of seekers, and I'm going to describe to you the 4 different kinds of seekers. And they're all true within their own perspective. But as Baha'u'llah also quotes one of the hadith, the good deeds of the righteous are the sins of the near ones. So there's relativity, even within those who are spiritual, there's relativity of what's considered good and bad. Yeah.
Trying to be concise, we've talked about so many things. That's wonderful conversation. The physical and the spiritual, the collective and the individual. My soul, make it actionable. I'm going to pass to the next world. How do I know I'm on the right track?
How do we know we're on the right track?
Well, pulling everything. I mean, you talk about many things.
Yes.
You haven't talked that much about the soul. You talk about spirit. You talk about physical reality.
Yes.
The science of our advancement and so on.
Yes.
You talked about our progressive revelation and our mankind and our humankind. But hey,
what's the litmus test?
What about the next world?
So,
what am I doing? And am I progressing?
And so this is where the rubber hits the road. So all of this is. Let me give one more sort of theoretical thing, and then we'll get to the practical. So there was one more theoretical thing I wanted to say. So we talked about relativity. We talked about complementarity. So there's relative perspectives, there are certain perspectives which are so, on opposite poles that you got to pick one or the other. You kind of can't hold them both in your head at the same time. There's a third, I think, deep principle, and that was mentioned this was in Unit 4, I think. I have a note on that. No, it wasn't. It was in one of the units where Baha'u'llah says, for everything there is in this universe, every form, every substance, every attribute, there is in each one of the worlds of God a corresponding form and substance and attribute with, relative to its own state. So Baha'u'llah is stating a principle of almost a mirror principle, a principle of symmetry, that in any given, as we traverse this circle of existence in its various degrees, the truths and structures and ways and substances and forms and so forth relevant to one degree are repeated at the next degree. There's an echo principle or a mirror principle. Abdu'l-Baha puts it in one way that the microcosm and the macrocosm are reflected in each other. He also says in the Tablet of the Universe that the physical and the spiritual are reflected. One is a reflection of the other. Baha'u'llah tells us that this physical world is a shadowy image of the spiritual world. And so there's a principle of symmetry. And by symmetry I mean you shift things, but things are still the same. The idea of symmetry in a circle is you rotate the circle by any amount, and you get the same circle. The circle has a certain kind of continuous symmetry. You take a square and you rotate it 90 degrees in either direction, or flip it, and you get the same square. So a square has both rotational symmetry as well as reflection symmetry. So there are different kinds of symmetries in the world that have been defined by mathematics. And these symmetries are some of the deepest principles of the physical world. And these symmetries are the modern formulations of the laws of physics, both in quantum mechanics and in general relativity on either side of the chasm, are expressed in terms of laws of symmetry. That you shift something, and when you get to the laws of physics, that thing that you're rotating may be a very abstract rotation. It's a rotation in some sort of spin space or some quantum number space or whatever. But after you make that rotation, something is the same and something is different. And so much of the laws and forces and substances of nature come out of these symmetry principles. There's likewise symmetry principles in religion. So what's an example of a symmetry principle in religion? The oneness of the prophets. You change from one prophet. Prophets are interchangeable in a sense. You swap one for the other, and the same light shines. You get the same thing. Human souls, there's a symmetry principle sort of active within human souls. We all contain the rays of the divine light. Sort of switching from one soul to the other, and it's almost, in one way, it's the same configuration. Seeing our souls in the sort of most sort of divine, abstract perspective. So there's a principle of symmetry in the spiritual world, as well as the physical world. There's a principle of relativity, and there's a principle of complementarity. And when you ask a theoretical physicists, what are the basic ideas of physics? What are the most fundamental? What are the deeper principles? What are the deeper teachings of theoretical physics? They would say relativity, symmetry, and complementarity. And those also, I think in a non-accidental sense, also form the foundation of what we might call some of the deeper principles of the Baha'i revelation, which we wouldn't be surprised. We shouldn't be surprised, because we believe science and religion are harmonious. And by saying that, it doesn't just mean that the results of science shouldn't contradict religion, but at a much deeper level, the structures and principles at play in the realm of science are the same as the structures and principles at play in the realm of religion, according to this mirror principle that we read in this tablet by Baha'u'llah. Okay, so this is kind of the theoretical picture, and we have this idea of a circle of existence which pulls everything together very neatly. It explains where everything came from and where everything's going. It explains where we are in the scheme of things. It explains what we used to think of as a very sharp division between material and spiritual as being actually relative to our position along that circle of existence. It resolves the conundrums raised by metaphysical dualism. And it replaces it with more of a monistic picture of the universe, in which there really is only one thing, there's only one substance, but it's seen under different aspects. And it does it in a way that doesn't require you to reject dualism. There's still in front and behind, and it's still very well defined. There's still good and evil. It's still very well defined. It's just relative to your position. And this is where the rubber starts to hit the road, because this is where the realm of theory starts being translated in the realm of action. Because in saying religious truth is relative, we don't want to end up with a position in the world where all actions go, where everything is fine. Well, that's your perspective, that's okay. Because not everything we do is equally fine. Certain human actions run contrary to the direction of the circle of existence. And that ends up being our litmus test. Our litmus test both in our own personal spiritual lives and the litmus test in terms of our collective lives. And the litmus test is, does this action, does this policy, does this motion of the community tend towards moving us along the circle of existence? And what that means practically is, does it conduce to unity? Because that's the direction. The direction of the circle of existence is the direction of unity. The more unified we become, the farther along that circle we go. Why? Well, you could say the physical reason is, the more unified we are, the more you have a deep interrelationship between the different parts. And just like in physical beings, the more interrelated they are, the more complex they are, the better substrate they can form for expressions of higher degrees of consciousness. We couldn't have the consciousness we have if we were as simple as a paramecium or as simple as an ant. We need to have a certain degree of complexity in our physical bodies. There has to be a certain interplay between different groupings of cells that have specialized functions for this magic of consciousness to emerge. Similarly, human society has to be integrated and unified to a certain degree before even higher powers become available and visible. Powers and capacities and advances that we can't even imagine right now, because we're so at odds with each other, because so much of the energy of the human race is spent in undermining each other rather than lifting each other up, in cutting down in a tribalistic mentality that sees the world as a zero-sum game, that my gain is someone else's loss, and vice versa. Once we transcend that way of looking, we're moving along the circle of existence to a higher order of unity. And of course, the highest order of unity on this planet is what we all know we're moving towards, which is one global society, which is directed in an integrated and coherent way that is able to maintain the diversity and differentiation of the individual parts, just as in the individual human body. It works through the diversity and interconnection of parts. That's how the body, and this is the principle of symmetry as well. It's the principle of symmetry between the operation of the human and the operation of human society. So that gives us a sort of a litmus test, and it sort of puts, it sort of takes the theory into the realm of action, because otherwise we'd get lost in the relativities. You'd say, well, it's all relative, so how do we decide what's right? How do we decide what to do? And particularly in the spiritual realm, all these different people are going to be at different spiritual states with different ideas about what's right and wrong. And the good deeds of the righteous are the sins of the near ones. So people are going to have legitimate and very, very heartfelt opinions about what other people might be doing. So what do we do in those cases? Well, Baha'u'llah gave is such a simple thing, and it's brilliant what Baha'u'llah did. Of course, it's brilliant, but it's really brilliant even from, I think, an outsider perspective. It's so brilliant what Baha'u'llah did. He basically said, vote on it, right? He said, elect your houses of justice, and your houses of justice will decide. He took the principle of democracy, which is a child of the Enlightenment. This is one of the first things to emerge from Enlightenment thought, is the idea, well, hold on. Instead of everyone being ruled by some divine dictator, essentially a king with absolute power, one of the brilliant flowers and fruits of the Enlightenment was this idea that we rule best when we rule when everyone has a voice in our leadership. And Baha'u'llah, I won't say he took that idea from the Enlightenment. I mean, it was revelation. But one can look at it as he took that same idea of, you democratically elect your leaders. Your leaders consult in their decisions. They make decisions according to the exigencies of the day. And he gave that and he said, and this is what rule by God is. This is divine rule. This is the divine system for the day. This is the divine administrative order. What it really is democracy in action. I mean, true democracy in action, where everyone has a voice. Decisions are made through a consultative process. And in the end, Baha'u'llah says, if you do it in this way, it's going to have he puts the stamp of the divine upon it, the stamp of authority upon it. And this provides, this is like, so much of what I'm saying is speculative. This is even more speculative. But one possible future, when we ask, where is this all going? At what point does the evolution of Baha'i administration, Baha'i administrative structures, begin to really intersect with the administration of the world, the current political systems of the world? At what point do these start interacting, and what's going to happen? Is there going to be some clash and some overthrow in one of the winds? Is there going to be a revolution? I mean, how is the world going to come around to adopting these principles? And they'll hopefully see a working model in the Baha'i faith. And one possible future is they look at that working model and they say, oh, here's a better way of doing governance. Why don't we implement these ideas? A consultative body, makes these decisions. That consultative body is elected through the following principles that manages to mitigate or minimize issues of polarization and tribalism and partisanship by having elections, not having electioneering and so forth. All the mechanisms of our administrative order. You can imagine people looking from the outside in and saying, oh, that's a better way of doing it. Let's adopt that. And before we know it, the whole world is adopting these Baha'i administrative principles. Before you know it, there's a seamless merger between them.
How nice.
Wouldn't that be nice? And the Baha'is would say, oh, this is our idea. And the world would say, well, this is just best practice. Who knows? Who knows how it's going to go? But through all of this and sort of at the end of all of this, I think we'll find that this way of looking at the world, this sort of non-dualistic way of looking at the world, this non-tribalistic way of looking at the world, will contribute to the transformation in our view of organized religion, away from this idea of it being competing spheres of competing memberships, competing dogmas and doctrines, but rather see it, as the House of Justice suggested, as Baha'u'llah's revelation, as recasting the very conception of religion as the principal force impelling the development of consciousness. And that development of consciousness is that development along the circle of existence. The circle then becomes the governing metaphor that unites, that shows the relative truths of different of different degrees along that circle within their proper place, and which is a beautiful image of of what Baha'u'llah refers to as God's knowing of his own essence and loving of his own essence. And what the great scientist and popularizer of science Carl Sagan said in the opening episode of Cosmos, airing on TV in the 70s, he said, "We are a way for the cosmos to know itself." So that's about all I had. There's a lot more, but that's enough for the moment. You want more? Do we have more time? So we have time for questions and pushback and where does this all go wrong? You know.
So a little more about yourself, just so we get the context. This is kind of a brilliant approach. Who are you?
Who am I?
You see what I'm saying?
Ask me a
Science.
question. Yeah. Okay. So where does this all come from? As an undergraduate, I majored in physics and philosophy, and so I always had this real interest in how these things fit together. You know, what's ultimate reality and that sort of thing. I came from a Baha'i family, so I also, had read the Baha'i writings as a child. And was always trying to apply it. And how do you pull together science and spirituality and religion and philosophy? You know, all of those together. I spent a couple of years after university on a year of service. It ended up being two years of service in Haifa. And while I was there, I was encouraged by Mr. Dunbar to study Arabic. And the reason why, he gave me the perfect incentive. He said, all these cool ideas that you're interested in, he said, most of them are in untranslated tablets. He said, so you're going to have to translate those tablets if you want access to those ideas, you know. And he said, I suggest you do Arabic first. He said, because it's harder. And then after that, he said, Persian is going to be really easy, but you're going to have to learn Persian too. So I started learning Persian, Arabic, and took that opportunity of those 2 years of service, kind of between undergraduate and graduate school, to dive as deeply as I could into the writings. I made full use of the Baha'i library and copied all the pilgrim notes I could find, all the obscure corners. You know, I looked out all the provisional translations I could find. I harvested and made into this huge compilation with 5,000 quotes in it on all of these themes. So if you're interested in these themes, they exist in a compilation which is online on a website called loomofreality.org. Loom, L-O-O-M. So go to loomofreality.org and you'll find all of the quotations that you saw in the units, plus about 5,000 more. Organized, you might recognize elements of the organization from the last few sessions. But all of the raw materials that are in my head in relation to the Baha'i writings and quite a bit beyond are organized in that compilation. After those 2 years of service, I went back to graduate school and got a PhD in physics, and my specialization was cosmology. So my dissertation was measuring the mass of the Milky Way galaxy on the basis of motions of and clustering of nearby galaxies, using principles of symmetry and Lagrangian mechanics and lots of cool stuff.
What's the weight?
About 1 trillion m-sun, which is a bit higher than most estimates. And so we're out of time, so if you want more. So after that, I went back to Haifa for 13 years in the research department and helped to translate Baha'i writings for 13 years. And continued the sort of journey of discovery into Baha'i writings and beyond. And I've been back in the U.S. now for 4 years.
So
in Portland.
Have you ever done a TED Talk, or have you thought?
I've never done a TED Talk. I'd love to do a TED Talk someday. If this could all be crystallized in a TED-like fashion. Yeah. Just there.